Hey guys, you're listening to episode 183 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Keelan, and I'm here with my co-host and brother Cody. How can Christian leaders guard against mission drift before they even realize it's happening? Today's guest is Becca Spradlin, founder of On Mission Advisors and author of Lead on Mission. Becca works with faith-driven nonprofit and business leaders around the world to help them define and protect what she calls their organizational North Star, so their mission stays rooted in Christ for generations. In this conversation, Becca shares what she's learned from years of studying mission drift, helping organizations navigate leadership transitions, growth, and success without losing sight of why they began. We also explore the role of givers, leaders, and stewards in protecting the integrity of kingdom work. If you care about stewarding influence, leadership, or resources for eternal impact, this episode is for you. Before we get started, I want to ask a quick favor of you guys. If you've been listening to the show for some time and want to support what we're doing, one very easy and free way to do that is to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Just write whatever you like about the show and you'll help others find us. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the show so you're the first to know when new episodes come out. And with that, let's get started. We're here today with Becca Spradlin. Becca, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So why don't you just start us off telling us a little bit about some of the early days? What kind of a home did you grow up in, and how did you come to faith?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home. It was such a gift. I had a very prayerful mom as well, I wish everyone could have that, but especially being a mom now, that she was a great example for me. She continues to pray for me and my brother and kind of help hold our family together. We lost my dad when I was 18, so her being such a strong pillar for our family, for my brother and I, and really encouraging us to do things like mission trips and pursue careers that we wanted to, and not feel like we had to go a certain traditional route was just such a gift. But growing up in that home, I came to know Christ when I was maybe 6 years old. That's what I remember, praying that prayer, asking Jesus to come into my heart. And I feel like it was probably more of like how a child might envision a flannelgram Jesus, like moving into their heart. But I think over the decades that followed, it kind of moved from being more head knowledge to heart knowledge. And it's certainly a journey, but I was so grateful to have that start to my life.
Becca, I'd love to hear, as you grew up, how did that foundation of faith in your family really start to influence you as you got older?
Yeah, well, I think those of us who follow Jesus Christ, there's something we may take for granted, which is there's always hope. There's always hope, even after, like, especially during that season where my dad passed away. I mean, I remember feeling like I don't know if I'm ever going to be happy again, but I just sensed the Lord's presence carrying me through that time. And I would say that was a moment, again, I was about 18 at the time, where I really felt like the Lord's nearness and presence in my life in a very different sort of way. And I know a lot of people can probably resonate where we feel closer to God, maybe in those valleys of life that He brings us through. So that was certainly one of the ways, but I feel like I continue to see God show up in my life from the small details of things in my business to bigger things, and even just looking back at the path He's put me on. That's not something I would have mapped out as a teenager in college, but He just continues to lead me every step of the way. So it's definitely left an imprint on me, and it's something I'm grateful for to this day.
After college, as you started to look into career and direction and what you might put all your energy into, how did He start to shape that journey for you?
Yeah. Well, in college, I was a business major, and honestly, going into it, I was like, I just want to make a bunch of money and give money away. I think that's how I thought my life would kind of play out in terms of like advancing the kingdom of God. God had other plans. Actually, it was my sophomore year of college. I did an international missions trip to Guatemala. And the next year, I led a team to Haiti. And those experiences really, really moved my heart, seeing that kind of global poverty in the places we were serving. And I was a business major. I was committed to that. But it really kind of thrusted me to think about, how can I do something about this? So I moved into to study more economics, and the Lord opened doors for me to work in international economic development and led me into a career in microfinancing. And, again, that's not what I planned to do, but it was a neat way to help inspire entrepreneurship around the globe. And it resonated with my kind of business wiring. So again, he led me to that.
Yeah, so as you were looking to build the kingdom, which I mean, I also came out of college looking to make a bunch of money, but it was not to build the kingdom. It was for totally different reasons. But how did you get connected to Hope International, and what did that season of your life look like?
Yes. Again, another God moment for me. So I landed a job at a very niche company that did microfinance ratings. So things rating agency like Standard and Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, but specialized for microfinance institutions. And I was doing that work in the DC area, as well as research into the investment flows into the sector. And I was speaking at an event at UPenn, and someone in the audience was from Hope International, but also went to my alma mater, Grove City College. So we connected, and I ended up in an attempt to sell them some social ratings, which we were doing as one of the things we did at the rating agency. She followed up and said, I think you should come work for Hope International. So it was probably one of the worst sales calls, but it piqued my interest into Hope. And I just finished my master's at that point. So I was like, well, my CV's updated. What can it hurt? I'll just go ahead and send it to them. And several months later, my husband and I ended up moving from the DC area to Lancaster, Pennsylvania to do microfinance work at Hope International.
We've had a number of guests on from Hope International, which has been a lot of fun and certainly is a very unique organization with a strong culture. I'd love to hear during your time there, what was God doing in your heart? How was He shaping and developing you and even preparing the ground for what was in store?
Vocationally, it certainly influenced my career, but spiritually, just the times of devotion we would have together, the prayer times we would have together, and getting people who just genuinely love Jesus together. We're not perfect. It's not a perfect organization, but it was a really tremendous culture. And getting to learn and grow from people who, express their faith differently or come from different denominations was such an enriching experience for me personally. So there's a lot of spiritual growth happening. But right around the time I joined Hope International, the CEO, Peter Greer and Chris Horst, wrote a book called Mission Drift. And this book was about to be released. My role was microfinance field focus, but they asked me if I could create an assessment, given my ratings background, create an assessment for us to use internally at Hope to know not if, but where we're drifting. So those are Peter's words, to know not if, but where we're drifting, because we're all drifting at any time and we need that accountability. So in 2014, we created this kind of first pass of this internal mission alignment assessment. We started using it in different country offices. And within a year after that, someone on the board said, hey, could you come and do this assessment for our organization? And as the book got out there and Peter was speaking a lot about the book, people would follow up with him and say, hey, we would love to have a workshop on this or something like that. And so being open-handed is one of the kind of hallmarks of the Hope culture. So we were going and doing workshops and assessments for other organizations, very passively serving these needs. And that's really what opened the door to my kind of next and current chapter vocationally, where I'm helping other organizations understand where drift is, understand what drift could look like for them, and take steps at a board level or executive level to avoid it. So again, God's sense of humor and design plan for all of this, but taking that work we were doing within Hope, after doing it for several years, I had that conversation with Peter. I think more organizations could be helped by this type of consulting support. What if it wasn't just passively responding, but even more proactively offering those services, offering education to help boards and leaders really get sensitized to the real risk that drift is for every Christ-centered nonprofit and kingdom-minded business? How do we understand what the mission is? And then what can we do to be really intentional, to really steward the current season of influence that each of us has, to steward that season of influence in a way that allows the mission to continue beyond our tenure? So God's intervention is required for all of this, but what can we do today to be really intentional on that front?
Yeah, and I think we're going to dig a whole lot into that in the next bit of time that we have together. But before we get into that, that is really interesting kind of live figuring this out in the context of hope. And
Mm.
be interested to hear, you're given this task, which, maybe you could fit that onto one piece of paper about the goal, but it's definitely not that simple in terms of executing. And I'm sure there's a little trial and error as you're like, okay, so how do we actually measure and kind of quantify or categorize this
Mm.
across different parts of the organization? Where did you start, and what did you learn in some of the early process of trying to put that together that has shaped now how you think about it?
Yes, it definitely evolved over time. That's a really good insight. Honestly, I pulled from some of my background experience doing social ratings and some of the things that were going on in the microfinance industry at the time to kind of figure out the structure and just the patterns and the method of doing ratings was pretty easy to just pull from prior experience. And then we leveraged the book a lot, the Mission Drift book I mentioned that Peter and Chris wrote, and some of the key indicators there. So we started with those. I did get input from other folks as well as we kind of piloted. We say we piloted them in 2014. That's when we got started. But honestly, doing them for other organizations as well and starting that, getting exposure to others really made what we were doing inside of Hope stronger as well, because you learn more from other organizations' cultures as well. So even now, we continue to do these assessments. I'd say most of the work we do today is more on the educational, upfront defining work to help organizations get really clear on their mission and kind of define the guidance and guardrails around that. But when we get a chance to work with those organizations like Hope and others that are ready for that assessment work, it flexes a little bit with the mission that we're trying to do, but we're always looking at different categories, understanding the people, understanding there's a lot of listening work that has to happen for the assessment. So we'll do surveys of the whole team and the board. We'll do interviews. We're doing document reviews. So between those three things, we try to triangulate, okay, between what we say the mission is and the current culture and what's actually happening, how close are we and how likely are we to stay on this mission? What's our level of mission resilience? So it's definitely evolved over time. I think it was probably a couple years into doing this research, I was actually driving to do a workshop, and this thought of, there's three different kind of components to what we're trying to help organizations do. One is define. How do we define the mission, make sure it's clear what the mission is, and also define what drift is, because I think it's rare to go to an organization and it's like, yeah, we have a clear, well understood, aligned perspective on what drift is. I think each person has a definition, but it's not always out in front and defined. So we start with define, then protect, and champion. And so that model of three evolved over time. So protect would be your kind of defensive. We've got it defined. How do we have it in our bylaws? How do we have that kind of legal protection and guidance and that legal structure? It's reflected in our processes and everything we're doing in terms of hiring and metrics and all of that. And then champions that forward-looking culture piece. It's all about your people and getting the right board members and leaders and people on the team, and then infusing that culture, mission into the culture to make sure it will last well beyond you. And so between that define, protect, champion framework, I had that for a couple years, and I realized I'm like, there's a missing piece here. And it came down for me to, how do leaders know how to define, protect, and champion that higher purpose the Lord's giving them for their business, for their nonprofit? And it's through abiding. John 15:5, how can we encourage people to really stay connected to the vine? And so we always encourage that as part of the work we're doing. How are we listening to the Lord? How are we seeking his leading and being prayerful, whether we're designing a strategy or figuring out our guidance and guardrails to stay on mission and avoid drift? How do we make sure we're always seeking the Lord, and ideally building up a team that's organizationally and individually always seeking the Lord as well? So that's just a little bit of how it evolved over time, but evolving and adapting to what would best serve clients. It's not always an assessment. Sometimes it's more, getting workshops, getting education, helping their boards become more sensitive to the mission as well.
I'm curious, as you formed this assessment and you were taking it to other organizations, what were some of the things that you were finding? What was surprising to you? And at what point did you realize that this was something that God was calling you into, this specific work?
Yeah. There was one moment, I don't know if it was one of the earlier assessments I did for another organization. And I was sitting there talking with a senior leader, super well credentialed. And I'm like, this person is saying all the right things, but there's something it's not quite right. And I remember going for a walk afterward, you're processing the day, you're processing these interviews as part of this assessment. And I kind of landed on this term. This person is a passive acceptor of the mission. And a big point I make in workshops and things like that is the hiring is critical. Hiring and recruiting new board members is absolutely critical to carrying the mission forward. If you bring on passive acceptors, and passive acceptors would be people who, if you have a statement of faith, they would sign it. They're saying, yeah, that's great. You have a Christian dimension to what you're doing, but I'm here for the, humanitarian aid or the healthcare, the, whatever the thing is, one of the primary outcomes of your organization. And what will happen is that passive acceptors will not defend the spiritual dimension of the work, especially when there is, pressure coming against, or maybe a great opportunity comes. I was just with a nonprofit in Guatemala last week, and they're saying, we have a number of grants that we're putting out there. And they'll say, we could fund you if you could just take off the part about Jesus. And that well-intentioned passive acceptor will say, great, money is critical to do this mission, and maybe we can't use it to share about Jesus over here, but you could still do that over there. Why not just pursue it? And so not only may they not defend it, but they may also steer you to pursue grants like that or things like that that could eventually and will eventually turn you away from that kind of core purpose to advance the kingdom of God over time. You'll start to drift. You'll see that erosion happen of the mission. And so that was one of my earliest learnings that I still talk about today, is just in hiring, be so sensitive to avoid those passive acceptors. And a really strong culture may eject some of those kind of people if they come, or potential board members will just probably be turned off at the outset. But you never want to bring those folks into the team, even if you do think you could minister to them and help them grow in their faith. Unless that's part of your mission to do that, it might just be better to find someone else to fill a role. So that was definitely one of my early learnings.
Yeah, as you were sharing, I was actually wondering how you actually define mission drift. Because, I know in the book Mission Drift, they talk about especially the spiritual dynamic of it. A lot of what you're talking about here of compartmentalizing, aspects of what you do, kind of cutting things out when needed and that kind of thing. But as I'm just kind of thinking through other things that I've seen, there's also kind of the rapidly expanding scope of what you do instead of, kind of staying focused in on your core of what you're best at or most passionate about. But are there, other flavors of that in terms of the kind of things that you see?
Absolutely. Yes. So the mission drift, obviously, that I care most about, and is reflected in Peter's book on mission drift as well, and the book Lead on Mission as well, is that drift from the higher purpose that God's called you to. So it's going to look different for everyone, but what is that higher purpose he's calling you to advance the kingdom of God? Again, it will look different in different contexts and different organizations, but staying faithful to that calling that he's given to the organization. And that's what we care most about. But the term mission drift is much wider than that. Certainly in the microfinance sector, we were talking about mission drift, and it had nothing to do with faith. And I think the mission drift is pervasive in the nonprofit sector as well. And the kind of mission drift you're hitting on, which I also care about, is, you can call it scope creep. You can just spreading yourself too thin. And that is certainly something you want to pay attention to, because think about it. Nonprofits are attracting people who are passionate about a particular cause. And what can we do in that? You say yes to more things to help with the mission, to help with the cause. And you can start to stretch yourself out way too thin. It can lead to burnout, certainly, which I think increases your exposure to drift. If you take on too many things and then you're like, oh, we need to keep funding these things, then you might compromise on the funding piece. So I say that you'll find drift in 3 areas. So any case of drift that you've heard of, there's drift in the funding area where you're compromising to get that funding. And I think when we take that, quote, no margin, no mission, when you take that too far, I think it will lead you to compromise because God is the provider. He controls the pace of growth of your organization. I think if we're so focused on getting that next dollar that we're compromising our faith, I think that feels inconsistent for me with the calling God has for your organization. So being really careful about accepting funding, especially funding with strings attached. Now, if a corporation wants to give you money and they know about your faith identity and they're okay with that, that's great. But I say always just be careful about donor diversification and making sure that you're not dependent on any one donor, even if they are aligned. And certainly if there are major donors you have that are corporations or ones that don't have that faith motivation, just be very, very cautious and build up reserves so that if you were to lose them or if they were to kind of say, hey, we actually can't give to you anymore unless you again take the faith piece down, that you're prepared to say no to that because you want to make it easier for yourself and future leaders to say no to those things because it's just so clear. That's not who we are. That's going to derail us. So watching out for drift in the area of funding, programmatic drift, which is what you are hitting on, is starting to do things that aren't bad necessarily, but they're not in kind of the center of the bullseye for you. And when we start to move outside that center, I think it can pull us and distract us. And if nothing else, it could burn out your team because, learning a whole new thing is going to take a lot of time and effort. And it's going to divert attention away from the core activities that you might be called to do. So you got to look at, again, funding, programmatic. Sometimes those things come together. Hey, we'll give you money to do this thing. I was talking with a nonprofit recently and they shared how it was a Christian foundation. And they said, well, we don't have funding anymore for maybe how we supported in the past, but we do have some funding available for a hospital. And so they started thinking about well, should we do a hospital? Da, da, da. And they came back and said, a hospital would be great. It would be helpful, but that's not something we can do. And the foundation came back to them and they said, it was actually a test. So that was one of the first cases I'd heard of where the foundations were testing someone who'd been a recipient of their funding. But I think it's just always, again, be true to yourself and to the mission the Lord's given to you because others will be able to pick up on that. And maybe they would have been able to do the hospital and do it really well. But I think just always be in tune with what the Lord's telling you to do, not necessarily what a donor is telling you to do. So again, the 3 buckets of drift is funding, programming, and the last one is people. So I kind of mentioned this one already, but when we compromise to get that really credentialed board member, that really credentialed leader, and we don't do enough due diligence on the character and the culture and the faith alignment, there are so many cases of what that leads to. It can really set your organization back. It could, lead to the end of your organization if it's significant enough. So being really careful about how you select, especially your board members and your leadership team, just being really careful on the vetting of that.
You mentioned your book, Lead on Mission, and you now work with leaders in this capacity to help them have these conversations and understand how to navigate these types of situations through on-mission advisors. And this applies in both nonprofit and for-profit organizations. It's not exclusive to one or the other. Anyone in a leadership position needs to be thinking through some of these things. And I'm thinking from 2 different angles, especially on the nonprofit side. There's the leadership aspect, and then there's also how can we as givers partner better with organizations? And I'd love to spend a little bit of time on both of those, but let's start with the leaders who you are primarily serving. What does it look like when they are controlling for mission drift well? And then what does it look like when they don't have systems to prevent it?
Well, I always say there is a strong level of selection bias to the folks that we work with because they are choosing to get support, either come and evaluate what we're doing or come and help us learn. So I always say a prerequisite of any great leader, but certainly a leader that's sensitive to mission drift, is humility, because there are multiple scriptures and examples in the Bible of people drifting and the importance and the caution for us to pay attention lest we drift from what we've been told. And in Hebrews 2, it's there. It is pervasive among people, and that's why it's pervasive among organizations. So I do think a humility. I always get concerned when people would say, like, well, this would never happen to us, which I always say, maybe it wouldn't happen under your leadership, but it's one transition away from happening then. And people can drift too. People that were once really strong in their faith can drift over time. So I think there are a lot of factors, but I think humility and staying rooted in Jesus Christ in your personal relationship, those would be the building blocks to building an organization that stays on mission. So I can't emphasize enough, if you're hiring for a new leader, especially a leader you're bringing in from the outside, really knowing them well enough to know, like, they're abiding in Jesus outside of the work of the organization. That's just who they are and what they do. And they're going to bring that passion, that commitment to seeking the Lord, even when it's busy and overwhelming, that willingness to pause and pray, remembering who God is, because we all need to encourage each other on that. We all are prone to wander and prone to drift. So I think for the leadership piece, that's paramount. On the giving side, I love that you asked about the givers, because I'm hearing that, on the nonprofit side, that donors are asking, hey, what are you doing to avoid mission drift? And I love that donors, I think more donors, especially if you're a major donor, really be asking, because maybe they'll be on mission today, but drift is so pervasive. How do we know that they're going to stay on mission? And how do we support those organizations that are doing the intentional work to do that now? So I think it starts by, if you're connected with your donor representative for that nonprofit, asking them, what steps are you taking to stay on mission? Seeing what they say on that and how they define mission drift. Are they just, caring more on the programmatic side, or do they care about the spiritual dimension of the work that they're doing? And is that obvious in their reporting? I think another step that donors can take, I think donors can be a really great support in this. They can provide a great level of accountability for organizations to stay on mission. And one of the ways, whether you're on the board or you're a donor, is just really being sensitive to an organization's language and language choices. For example, as you're reading through their annual report, is it clear about the spiritual dimension of what they're doing? If you're at an event, is that coming out, or do you feel like there's maybe inconsistency between what you're hearing from your donor rep and what's being presented on the stage, or the annual report, or that letter, or the website even? So if you're finding inconsistencies, or it feels like Jesus is being downplayed in some places and highlighted in others, that's always kind of a yellow, red, orange flag for me. There should be really consistent communication about the model, about their approach, about their theory of change, regardless of the stage or venue. So I think donors, you can be sensitive to that. And if you see something that feels off, share it back with the organization, kind of communicate that to them, because sometimes it's unintentional. I always like to say it's always unintentional, but it can lead to more language like that if we're not holding each other accountable. So I think we all benefit from an extra set of eyes. So if you're seeing something from a donor perspective, that's always something good to highlight.
I really appreciate your perspective on that. And also, for givers who want to support an organization really well, I think, again, you shared a couple examples where a donor might have said, hey, can you just not talk about Jesus and then we'll fund you? Or the foundation who gave the test with the hospital. But I think a lot of times, like you said, it's unintentional, where maybe I'm just bringing my own life experience and I've made some assumptions about what you want as an organization. And I'd love to partner with you. And I love the work that you're doing. And let's do this together in this way. And I might be exerting influence without really realizing it. And that relationship, that communication that you're describing is so essential to be good partners together, because I think a lot of organizations are looking for more resources, and it's very tempting to go, that's not too big of a compromise. I think we can accommodate that. And there's no malicious intent on anyone's part. It's just a matter of drift, like we've been talking about.
Yeah, the influence goes both ways. So I think there's so many cases of, well, to get this new funding from donor XYZ, we just have to tone down Jesus a little bit. But then you'll have those other really strong and committed donors that see the faith dimension of what you're doing, and they'll help hold you accountable toward that. And I think Absolutely. Donors definitely have an influence, and the larger donor you are, the larger your voice is probably going to be heard by that organization. So I think if you can be mindful of that, be aware of that, and make sure you're encouraging them. Again, if you're the donor that just loves seeing the numbers and how many lives were touched, and whether it's meals or measures, just make sure you're balancing that drive for driving it down to the lowest cost per person with a really strong drive toward how are we taking time to share faith with Jesus, because that might drive up the cost in terms of the interventions that we're trying to do. So how do we make sure it's appropriate for that spiritual dimension and the impact that we want to see happening, as well as maybe some of the other areas of impact that you're trying to see in an organization?
This is an interesting topic because really the extra layer that I'm kind of pulling out from what both of you are saying here is that for a really good partnership, both the organization and the giver have to be clear on what their own mission is. And there has to
Mm.
be a pretty good overlapped match. And I think, from a lot of the examples that you've shared where things go wrong, at least on the funding side, it's because either the organization is not clear or holding tight to the mission on their side, which is a lot of what you do in terms of trying to help firm up that foundation. But the same issue I think there is on the giver side of just either not having a clear idea about what you're actually trying to accomplish in your giving, or having a clear idea, not really having a full match with the organization, but saying, well, maybe I can kind of get, what the goal I have in terms of reaching this region or tackling this
Mhm.
area. This organization is kind of doing that, but in some other way that is not, really fully aligned. And
Mhm.
there's basically a lot of compromising going on. If you have a mismatch, that's when you get pull of like, well,
Mm.
either a giver trying to, edge things over in a different direction or, or disappointment later on or something like that. And, I'd love to hear, I know that's not exactly what you spend all your time doing on the giver side, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And, even from your experience in working with organizations, what advice you would have for givers in just trying to get clear and focused on what their own mission is.
Yeah, excellent point there. More recently, I've been doing research on drift in Christian higher education. And as I've been talking with college presidents and universities and other kind of players in the system, I realize, we really need to name that any institution, any organization is feeling pressures to drift, but we're all operating within a whole ecosystem that is drifting. That includes your donor base if you're the nonprofit seeking donor support, but the donors are also drifting and feeling own pressures. So, one of the case studies we talk about is the Pew Foundation. A very intentional family, often gave anonymously, gave to Young Life, Youth for Christ, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, historically Black colleges, medical research, but they tended to give anonymously small amounts. They didn't have a big brand that was known way back when they were doing this in, say, the 40s, 50s, 60s, up till probably about 2000. So that wasn't a priority for them. So over time, though, things changed. And even institutions like they never tended to give toward Ivy League schools. Well, then a new leader comes in and they start giving to Ivy League schools. And within 20 years of J. Howard Pugh's passing, who was one of the founders, him and his siblings, they actually cut off funding from the Gordon Conwell Seminary that he helped give the startup capital to and committed to giving annually toward it. They cut off funding from that within 20 years of his passing. And again, maybe from the outside, and others have commented, it's like one of the gravest violations of donor intention. I think it can happen to donors too, even though you're not maybe seeking money from other sources. You have the money, but if you're not, again, getting the right people in place to follow you and defining what are those guidance and guardrails, to say, hey, we'd rather invest money in these nonprofits and not invest money in building up our brand as those leaders chose to do after Pew's passing. They invested heavily in their own annual reports and other things like that. So I think donors can absolutely drift. You see drift happening in families, you see changing preferences. And I think that's why there's a bit of a trend, I think, of people just saying, like, just do your giving while you're living, and just see those funds go to places that you care deeply about. Sometimes if you push it on to the next generation, it can feel more like a burden to them than a blessing, because maybe you love giving away things charitably, but for someone else to figure out what would their parents have wanted them to do with this money, it can be a burden, especially if it's not really clearly defined what you had hoped that money would accomplish. So I think being really thoughtful about if you do want to pass money on and you want it to be given through your foundation or donor advised fund or what have you, being clear about the types of organizations that A, center of the bullseye, would love to see more of it. B, okay, we're willing to go there, but not center of the bullseye. And then C, please don't ever give to these types of organizations. We feel like they're inconsistent with biblical values and certainly inconsistent with our family values. So I think that define, protect, champion work, it needs to be happening on the donor side as well, especially if you're a foundation. So that's my perspective. I think more thoughtful work. I do think sometimes donors don't exactly know what they want from a blank canvas. I think any of us, if we learned about an organization, you're like, wow, that's really inspiring, but I wouldn't have been able to name that before I knew it was happening. So I do think it will evolve over time as we get to know organizations, we get, a passion for the mission that they have, and we have trust for their leadership and their stewardship and accountability and all of that. So I do think our preferences can change over time, but I do think defining kind of what's center of the bullseye, what is okay, and then what is off the table from a philanthropy perspective at a minimum would be really helpful to make sure because again, the Pew Foundation, they were very intentional, but why wasn't that carried through even to the second generation leader? What happened there and why wasn't that continued? So yeah, I think clarity is helpful at every level, and certainly in donors and families as well.
And the concept of doing a vast majority or all of your giving while you're still alive, it's a very attractive thought, but the reality is there are some complexities within families who are stewarding a large amount of wealth, or institutional cases where there's a leadership transition, whether it's planned or unplanned. And having a plan in place for that succession, I imagine, is a major hinge point for the mission to drift, because a shift in leadership, especially if it's unexpected, can mean a rapid shift, and that may be intentional if the succession plan is not thought all the way through. How do you prepare leaders to approach succession well?
This is a big, I'll say, growth area or opportunity. Doing the research for Lead on Mission, which is all cases of kingdom-minded businesses that had, God-honoring values and mission, the difference between those that stayed on mission and the ones that didn't. And I think succession is a huge part of that. Unfortunately, research shows you both in the nonprofit and for-profit world, especially the smaller, medium-sized businesses, succession planning is completely, not happening as much as it needs to be happening. So it's a tremendous need for business leaders to be thinking about that, to be thinking about who am I raising up, ideally internally, if you want to preserve the culture and values, and if your company's performing well. Same for your nonprofit, it's performing well. If you have a healthy culture, what can we be doing to build up leaders internally? And maybe you don't have someone at the right level, but you could bring in someone at a COO level or a C-suite level to help get them up to speed, so that you have not just one prospective candidate for a board to pick from, but maybe 2 or 3. And that's not easy. So it's not easy. I'd say at a minimum, you should have an emergency succession plan in place to know if you were, hit by the donut truck, or if you were called to move to Tahiti tomorrow, what would happen to your organization? What would be that emergency plan? And then I do think in the nonprofit case, how do you and your board chair, the CEO and the board, have at least an annual rhythm or check-in saying, just to be clear, if the CEO's I'm not planning to go anywhere, but if I did, I'd give you a year notice or maybe a 2-year heads up or something like that, I think would be really helpful. what kind of lead time are you going to give? And who might be prospective candidates? Because I do think the quality of your leadership, for the CEOs and leaders listening, the quality of your leadership is shown after you're gone. How well is that organization performing after you're gone? How well is that next leader set up from a great budget that you help them bring in and have that ready for them to use, not leaving the organization in a lurch, not leaving them with a poor budget, not, leaving them in a weak position, but leaving them in a strong position so that it can excel and succeed and that culture and mission can continue without you. That's the sign of a really great leader. So I think too often leaders are, understandably just really busy with the day-to-day, but we do need to be thinking long-term about the success and the mission of the organization, which outlasts any of us. So that long-term vision, I think, is part of stewardship, is part of that way of being, forward stewarding your company, being a faith forward leader. How do we carry the faith forward? And it's not hinging on me, and the success of the institution is not hinging on me, but it can survive and thrive without me.
Becca, you brought up something really interesting that in my head, most succession happens either because of death or retirement.
Mm.
But you mentioned another instance where it might be an intentional shift in where you're focusing your time as a leader. It might be leaving that organization to do something that God's calling you into.
Mm-hmm.
And Keelan and I talk about the story of the rich young ruler in this context somewhat, where part of the difficulty of accepting Jesus' invitation when he said, "Go and sell all you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me," it might have actually been easier if he said, "Walk away from it," like he said to many of his disciples, but instead he said, "Sell all you have." And now he's wrestling through the complexity of what he actually owned, the people who lived on his land, the people he may have employed. And you can just start to think through, what would this look like in my life? It's too complex to just unwind it all. It would take forever.
Yeah.
And not having an emergency succession plan can really prevent us from even entertaining an idea like that. Even if it's clearly what God is speaking to us, we might just take that off the table by not preparing ourselves well.
That's a good word.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. And I hadn't made that connection before, but I think you're exactly right. And that's an easy one to, not think about at all, to just completely miss. But, we've talked a lot about mission, and I'd love if you could just define for us what a really well laid out, clear mission is. Because, every organization has something on a document somewhere. But,
Yes.
When you're looking at a mission, or if, an organization that's coming to you, asking for you to kind of check in on all of what they have, what do you look for? And yes, this is a very clear, actionable mission, or this is vague, or this is, setting the stage for a drift in the future.
So this is interesting because I've been talking with people, and one leader I was talking with in particular was sharing how, we're all pushed, and I will, encourage clients I work with, say, how do we make sure that this mission statement is memorable and sticky, which means it has to be short. It can't be too long. And this particular leader, this was just a few weeks ago, was telling me how, we tried to cut it down and make it into a tagline. And I feel like we really lost some of our essence in that process. And so when I think about mission drift, I actually kind of talk about that bigger purpose of the organization, especially in businesses that may not have it written into their mission statement, which is fine. I've talked to some really well-intentioned leaders that say, I don't ever want my mission statement to prevent non-believers from coming to work in my business, because I'd love to have a chance to show Jesus to them. I'm like, that's beautiful. So what is that, higher purpose? And I say it needs to be clear, and absolutely we want to document it well. We want it to be sticky. But I think even more important than that, and that is important, so I don't want to lose that, is that we are living it out as leaders. Leaders need to live it out consistently. It may or may not be on your wall, but it should be lived out in a palpable way that everyone gets it, can say it, can model it. The culture, the values, for me, that's even more important. And if you read Lead on Mission, one of the kind of cornerstone case studies is a Service Master company. And I think the unique thing about them, they wanted to raise the question of God in the marketplace. And this was way back before we had faith driven anything. This is early stages of this, and they really lived out a core set of values that they took decades for them to actually document and then put on the wall and spread throughout their global operation. So they were living it out. But when you see them start to drift, the values still stayed on the wall, even as they were maybe not lived out in the same way by leadership. And by the time those words came off the wall about honoring God through the work that they're doing, you might say, like, oh, that's a sign of drift. Well, the drift had already been happening at that point. They weren't living out those values consistently. So the language absolutely matters. But I would say how it's lived it out. The mission goes so much beyond the mission statement. And I hope that's freeing for people to hear, because it is hard to get a good, sticky mission statement. So one of the things we started doing, early into the on mission days of supporting organizations, was we realized that there was this need for something a little bit more, something that was a little more detailed than a mission statement. Then you could fit into that. Because we always say, like, oh, the mission guides our decision making. I'm like, well, if you have a really pithy kind of tagline-y mission statement, it may give you a high level guidance, but it's maybe not going to help you as much in some of the more details of what you're doing as a business or a nonprofit. So we started doing what we call our North Star, which is what's our North Star kind of guidance and guardrails to say, here's what we want to be about. Here's the processes we want to be about. This is the purpose. And to accomplish this purpose, this is how we want to hire. This is how we want to operate. This is who we want to partner with, and naming those things for the business. This is how we want to do philanthropy. And here's the things that are off limits. Like, here's what drift is for us, and here's what's off limits. And having those conversations with your leadership team, with your board, with a group of owners, in your business, can really help illuminate not just what you're against, but what you want to be for, and how to pursue those things with greater depth the more and more, your business and your nonprofit grows and serves. So I think that defining work becomes really helpful and helps free up from needing to put everything into your mission statement and making it way too long, or having this pithy mission statement that doesn't really guide. So that kind of supporting document, I call those, are the kind of structures that I think help organizations stay on mission, help new board members come onto your board and understand from the get-go of how the organization operates, how it elevates the name of Jesus, how it protects that mission. And those are the resources I think that help boards stay on mission and help prevent drift, just by being really clear and naming, this is, the mission statement, here's our vision and values, but here's how we live it out. Here's that next layer of guidance for you to use today, but also for future leaders and board members.
Becca, I'm curious to get your perspective on how to balance the desire to measure if we are on mission or not. And the introduction of data has been massively helpful and helped us understand things that were really hard to quantify before. But if we overemphasize it, there can be some detrimental effects to that. So how do you think about pursuing metrics in this conversation?
For any of us, we measure what's easy to measure, revenue, expenses, it's usually financial. And that's important and is part of, the fiduciary responsibility of a board, of an organization. We have to have all those numbers in check. But I would strongly encourage organizations, if you're looking at your key performance indicators, the ones that you're collecting on a regular basis, as regular as possible, I would encourage organizations to make sure some of those measures reflect the holistic nature of what you're trying to do. So we talk about, development, talk about 4 domains of impact, one of those being spiritual. Is there any way we can measure spiritual influence of your organization? And there's a whole spectrum of how you do this. We could talk for hours about this, but it could start with things like your inputs and your outputs and outcomes. Those impact is really hard to measure. It can be very expensive to measure. So if you're able to do that and do those types of studies, I think that's great to show if your intervention is having that, lining up with your theory of change. But I'd say, can we at least get to measuring your outputs and your outcomes? So those are things I think we can say, from a budget perspective, we are designated funding toward XYZ program, the spiritual impact of what we're doing, whatever is important part of your mission. And then how can we show the receptivity to that? How many people are engaging with that? And then outcomes, what are some maybe early indicators of change or effectiveness of that dimension of what we're doing? Again, it can be overwhelming. So I think starting with a clear definition of your mission, starting with how might we measure this beyond just the financial health of our organization. I don't think certainly measuring the health of your team is really important, but also that missional impact. How many lives are we reaching? And what does it even, when we say we're reaching them, what does that even mean? So being really clear with those terms, because your donors are going to ask for that. And it's guiding for you, not just to respond to donors, but for you as the leader. How do we know we have this money? How do we know what area, what program is most effective in fulfilling the mission? And how do we invest more in that one? And maybe wind up some of the areas that are less effective. So how do we make sure we have, to the best of our abilities, that kind of insight? And I do think there's more, I've been in meetings where we're talking about how do we measure the spiritual dimension of what we're doing and how learning from each other about how they're trying to do it. So I think it's super difficult to do. And I think we need to be okay with a lot of the spiritual impact we'll only know on the other side of eternity. Like Jesus knows, and that's good enough for us. But I do think to the extent possible that we can measure, just to know that we're being good stewards. We're being good stewards of what we've been given or what we're giving. I think that's a reasonable and worthy investment of our time and attention. I think as donors, you should be asking for that. And as leaders, we should know that. We should be able to use that information to guide our strategy and to guide our work as well. So I'm a fan of measures. I think measures will derail us if we focus too much on the financial measures and not enough on those measures of health and mission fulfillment. So I think we need to just engage and, lean into measures, but do so in a way that's really reflecting the full mission fulfillment of the organization and gives us a perspective on that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Financial is always easier to measure because it's in numbers, and everything else you have to go out and find. But it's often all that other stuff that actually provides the most insight to what's really going on, either for your own organization or for an organization you're looking to partner with in some way. So we've covered a whole bunch of ground, a lot of different areas that all play into mission drift. But I'd love to hear, from your expertise, what are the top 3 risk factors that you think play into mission drift? You're going to look at an organization without any context yet. What are the first 3 places that you're looking for to look for some instability on drift? And then what are the top 3 things that, somebody should look towards implementing today if they're trying to protect themselves or their organization from mission drift?
So I think in a nonprofit context or in a business context, looking at the boards, if there are boards in the business or owners for the owner case, really understanding what their heart for the mission is and assuming they're the ones guiding and steering the mission. That may not always be the case, certainly, but how much in tune and how passionate are they about the mission? Because I think that's probably the best indicator to know if this organization is going to stay on mission going forward. From there, I'd look to the leadership, because at the end of the day, they're the ones really going to be more involved in hiring. They also influence upward in terms of who gets on the board or becomes the next owner or partner or something like that. So I think between looking at the board, looking at the leadership team, and then maybe going a step further into the HR department and their hiring processes. So as you can tell, I'm leaning right into the people side of the mission alignment triangle. How are we doing on our hiring? How are we vetting people? How are we retaining people? And how are we, helping people who may not be the right fit? How are we helping them thrive well in a new context? So I'd look to the people dimension of what they're doing. And then I'd probably, in talking to those folks, just ask about, what are we doing for those big grants, the ones that are having us compromise or not, or what's our appetite for compromise on those things, or what can we or won't we compromise on? Because I think that's the next piece. So I'd look certainly at the people, then probably at the funding. And I think if you look at the people closely enough and you see engagement and levels of burnout, that gives you a good sense if you're stretched too thin programmatically. So I think that those would be the places that I would take a deeper look. So, in terms of steps you can take today to start getting more sensitive to this, one of the things that we've tried to do at On Mission is make sure there's plenty of resources to help folks get started on the journey. So, if you go to onmissionadvisors.com, we have a free self assessment for nonprofit, free self assessment for business. And as you take those, it will walk you through the best practices under each of those categories around define, protect, champion. So, that's something of really value to you. It's a free self-assessment you can take at onmissionadvisors.com. There's also Lead on Mission, a book you can get it on Amazon, to help you get some case studies and get a little more nuance and depth around each of those best practices. We call it faith forward leadership best practices. So those would be some resources to go to learn more and kind of improve your own skill and awareness and mission resilience awareness. But I think if you're on a board, for example, if you're a leadership team, I can't emphasize enough just the importance of prayerfulness and abiding about this topic. Just asking for God to make you sensitive to, is that organization drifting, or what can you do? I mean, it breaks my heart, but I'll do these talks and I'll have people maybe in middle management come up and say, like, I think my organization's drifting. And I know for them, it's going to be a very hard push uphill to see change happen. But I know we serve a God who does impossible things. So they're like, what should I do? I'm like, well, you need to discern what the Lord is calling you to do, because he may be calling for you to stay and fight, or he may be calling you to move and use your gifts elsewhere. And I certainly don't know what he's calling you to do, but I think prayerfulness is always the right place to start, and really seeking the Lord and discerning from him how to influence well from the position we are, whether we're a donor, whether we're a board member, whether we're on the team. How do we just be praying that God's kingdom would come through this organization and that he would guide us as to how to be a part of it? So that's where I'd start. And just, again, being intentional about our own faith and not neglecting to make sure we're not burning out, make sure we're operating from a place of health so that we can be strong against the enemy's attacks, because the spiritual dimension and warfare is very real. I mean, I feel it sometimes before I'm preparing to go be with a client. And I know my clients feel that as well. The larger you grow, the more missional you try to be for the kingdom, I think the target on your back grows bigger as well. So not neglecting those rhythms to make sure that we're just aware that the enemy is like a prowling lion ready to attack us, our team members, our donors, our board members. So how do we be prayerful in these things to make sure that we're here to honor God, we're here to do it his way, and we need his wisdom and protections and prudence to be courageous and to go where he wants us to go. So I think that personal relationship is foundational.
This whole conversation is really impactful. And I think about givers and even investors learning how to clarify what they want to move towards, what they maybe want to move away from, and organizations doing the very same. It sets the stage for a much better focus in the activities that they're doing or not doing, but also the potential for collaboration as you find other organizations, givers, investors who are focused in the same way that you are. Then you can more quickly discern who is a good partner and who isn't. So I'm excited to hear this conversation becoming more and more common, and that you've stepped into this role to serve people in this way. But what are you most excited about when you think about the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I was thinking about this recently, and I realized that even just might be more personally, like I will never know the impact of this work, because it could feel cerebral or it could feel so high level. Is it doing, how is God going to use this? But I always realize that for any of us, anyone listening, like we never know. I don't think we'll ever fully see all the fruit of the work that we're doing, but we're called to be faithful to what God has called us to. And I think you mentioned collaboration and community. And I think we need to encourage each other in this, because I do think the enemy will use discouragement and fear to dissuade us from taking those courageous steps of faith. So, I mean, what I'm looking forward to the next 5 to 10 years is to see more and more organizations getting intentional around these things, and the kingdom of God just growing, because organizations said no to seemingly good opportunities and yes to bigger kingdom opportunities, and more people coming to know Christ in a time that can feel so divisive, so just wild with everything that's going on. But more and more people, coming to know Christ through these faith-driven businesses, through really faith-forward nonprofits. and the work that they're doing and the intentionality that is just growing around this, around seeing if our intervention's effective and donors getting sharper on where they want to give to and how to encourage those organizations to advance the kingdom too. So my prayer is that, the work you're doing, the work all of us are doing is just this fragrant offering to God, and that more and more people come to know him through it.
Becca, as we get to the end of the episode, we want to leave some time for our Manager's Minute. We just end every episode with a practical action our listeners can take to step into their role as stewards and manage God's wealth wisely. So do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
Yes. So the other day, I overheard my 5-year-old talking to my other daughter, and she said, everything is God's. He's just sharing it with us. And I have no idea what they were talking about. She did not know I was listening, but I feel like the theme of stewardship certainly comes up in the work that I do, but for me personally and for our family has been coming up more lately. And I will say that actually was something you mentioned, we talked about earlier in the call, which is, I think I went into this, like, if I surrender everything to God, I have to give it all away, like the rich young ruler. And I feel like there was this really subtle shift in my mindset of, it is all God's. I have no idea if he wants me to give it away or when or how or all of it or some of it. No clue, but I'm much more at peace. It's like this heart posture of like, Lord, help us know how to invest wisely. We're trying to talk more to our investment advisors to say, hey, are we investing in anything that we really would be unhappy if we knew we were investing in that? Are there any screens we can start doing? How do we get intentional on that? Intentional on the giving side as well. But I just love that gem from my 5-year-old. It's all God. He's just sharing with us, and what he calls each of us to do with the wealth and the resources is along with the time and the talent that he's given to each of us and our health. It will be different for each of us, but it's the same thing I go back to for the organizations. It's how are we abiding in him to know what he's calling us to do today and in this moment and to build his kingdom. So I would say it kind of goes back to the mindset around not only the money we've been given, but our time and our health and our life and our even where he's placed us on the globe and our communities. How do we use all of this for his glory and really just peel back any of the stuff we're just doing for ourselves? And it's a journey. So that's just more of a recent revelation on this topic of stewardship that I've been noodling on, courtesy of God speaking through my 5-year-old. So
Yeah, I love that example. And when we understand our mission, obedience is going to look different for each of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a perfect example of how a child can understand that and we can apply that in our own lives. But Becca, we're so grateful for who you are, for coming and spending some time with us today, sharing a little bit of your story, and for the incredible work that you've stepped into and continue to do in service of the kingdom. So thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for what you're doing for the kingdom. I'm just so grateful for you.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 183. And if you'd like to get in touch, we would love to hear from you. Just send us an email at hello@finishlinepledge.com. Now, as most of you know, on the Finish Line podcast, we are all about stories, seeing how God draws us into generosity over a lifetime. But sometimes these stories can leave us thinking, what's that next step look like for me? That's exactly why we've launched a whole new podcast called Applied Generosity, which explores the full landscape of the generous life across 7 different dimensions of generosity. Applied Generosity helps make sense of the hundreds of stories we've shared on the Finish Line podcast to help you make that best next step. If you've been inspired by these stories and want to take things to the next level, check out Applied Generosity anywhere you listen to podcasts or at appliedgenerosity.com. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time.